Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. Today we have a hand from a $10, $20 no limit hold'em cash game. So I know most of my hands here on Poker News have been tournament hands, but I had a few cash game hands lined up on this program, Share My Pair, so I figured we'd go through them. Here we are playing very deep. So the blinds are 10-20, but the tight aggressive kid has $10,000, so a lot, right? He makes it $60 from the low jack seat, and I'm on the button with Jack 10 offsuit with 13,000, so 10,000 effective. This is a spot where I think you probably just want to fold or 3-bet, unless the players in the blinds are particularly bad. One very important skill of, well, poker in general, but deep stack poker especially, is keeping the weak players in the pot. And presumably, if I'm playing a cash game, it means there are a few weak players. Usually I'm not playing a cash game at a tough table just because I'm playing to try to win money, and you win money by playing with weak players. So we have a tight aggressive kid who's the initial raiser, which you probably are not going to want to play too many pots with. You know, you're going to play your hands, but you're not going to be actively trying to play with that person. But if the players in the blinds are particularly bad, then that could lead you to call on this spot. But I'm typically going to re-raise in this spot most of the time. And that is what I do. I make it 200. If I'm going to play this hand, by the way. I'm not playing this every time. I'm just folding sometimes. So I make it 200 and the opponent calls. And this is fine. This is not a problem. All right, flop comes ace 7-6. My opponent checks, and I decide to bet 160. If you've watched a lot of my videos here on Poker News, you know that when you re-raise pre-flop and the flop comes somewhat dry, especially when there's an ace on the board, it's a great spot to make a small bet. That is going to allow you to pick up the pot with relatively little risk. I'm not going to say no risk, but relatively little risk. And if your opponent does call, it's not like it's the end of the world. Usually you're giving up in these spots if you bet with total air on ace XX and your opponent calls. But if you get the vibe that your opponent is particularly weak, then I can certainly see continuing to get after it. So anyway, I bet 160 into the 430. And the opponent calls. Fair enough. Turn is a jack, so you make a pair. When your opponent check calls the flop, you have to think about what his range looks like, right? It's going to be mostly aces. It could have some hands like queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, 8s. It could also have hands like 9-8, maybe even stuff like 10-8 or 10-9. Notice we have a 10 in our hand, so those are less likely, though. It could be hands like 8-7. Could be 7-6, although that probably raises. Could be stuff like 6-5, mostly suited hands, the low cards. But you never know. Some people get really splashy in cash games, and they shouldn't really. So anyway, we get a jack on the turn. If our opponent has a 7 or pocket 9s, he's probably just going to fold to an additional bet. So now there's no purpose in betting. If we are going to bet here, we definitely want to bet on the small side, but I think betting here would be a very clear mistake because, like, what's going to call us, right? Primarily aces. What you'll see a lot of amateur players do here is they'll bet very big. They'll bet 600 into the 750 thinking, all right, I want to see if I have the best hand and I want to pick up the pot immediately if my opponent has a draw. But really, there aren't very many draws. The draws may even check raise you and put you in a miserable spot. Well, not even a miserable spot. You just have to fold. And the ace is never going to fold. So betting here, especially big, is a disaster. I'm almost always going to check back here, though, like 99% of the time. River is a king, which is kind of an interesting river. All right, and now our opponent bets $340 into this $750 pot. So what do we beat here? Well, we beat 9-8. That's a very obvious hand, but the 9-8 may raise the flop, so we can kind of discount those. That is really the only thing we beat at this point that our opponent would play in this manner. I mean, maybe he'd bet 9s or 10s or 8s on the river as a bluff, but it's relatively easy for me to just have an ace, right? Or it's relatively easy for me to have pocket kings that would bet the flop and then check back the turn. I could also have ace king. Did I mention ace jack? I could easily have ace jack. Although I would probably bet ace jack on the turn, so that's not necessarily true. I could also have queen 10. Notice if I had queen 10, I would very likely play it in the same way. So I have two really good nut hands here. I have pocket kings, and I have queen 10. And given I have jack 10 offsuit, I can certainly have all the combinations of queen 10 offsuit as well. So you always want to ask, would you bet the turn with queen 10? I mean, maybe I would. Maybe I wouldn't. I don't know. It depends. Maybe I bet. I probably bet sometimes and other times I don't. depending on the read. So here, when the opponent bets 340, I have a 10 in my hand, so it's unlikely my opponent has queen 10, especially given the way he played the hand. And I also have a jack in my hand, which makes it unlikely that my opponent has ace jack or king jack or pocket jacks. So all those two pair hands and sets are somewhat unlikely. So I don't think we can call here very often. I mean, are we good 25% of the time? I mean, it's probably not, right? So if we're not good enough to call, is this a reasonable hand to turn into a bluff? Typically, you want to be bluffing with hands that block the hands your opponent can call your raise with. So I think this is actually a very good bluffing candidate. Notice that we have a jack, so now ace jack and king jack are less likely. We also have a 10, so now queen 10 is less likely, although queen 10 is never check calling the flop, right? So pretty much the best hand our opponent's going to show up with here is going to be ace king sometimes. It did not elect to 4-bet pre-flop, which a lot of people just 4-bet ace king. It's going to be ace jack, but again, we block that. It could be pocket jacks, but again, we block that as well. There's one combination of jacks. He could have 7s or 6s. A lot of people just check raise those on the flop, though. Could also have ace 7 or ace 6, but again, a lot of people check raise those. So as you see, I'm listing out these hands, and a lot of them don't really fit in our opponent's range. Most of the time, our opponent's going to have something like ace queen or ace 10 or ace 9 or ace 8 that's putting in a thin value bet on the river to try to get called by a hand like king queen or queen jack or pocket queens. So for that reason, I think this is a nice spot to raise. So how much do we make it to try to get our opponent to fold out ace queen or ace 10? I think this is a pretty nice spot to make it about 1,000. If I did have a hand like queen 10, I'd probably make it about 1,000. If I add pocket kings, I would make it 1,000. So I like that. I don't think we need to go too huge. The times you typically want to go huge are when you have a lot of bluffs available in your range. And really, if you think about it, I have almost none. I mean, we're stretching to even find a bluff, and here we found it, this bottom or middle pair, right? And when you have to stretch to find the bluffs, that typically means you don't have very many bluffs in your range. And if you don't have very many bluffs in your range, then you should typically raise on the smaller side because you don't really care if you get called, right? Because you're going to have a good hand most of the time. So for that reason, this is a pretty nice spot to go for it, and I don't think you need to make it too big. Maybe even like 900 is better. You are going to get called sometimes, and that's okay. But if we're trying to play a somewhat strong, balanced strategy, it's okay to get called when you're bluffing sometimes. Obviously, you'd rather not get called, but sometimes you will. Now, if we're trying to exploit the opponent and really ensure he folds out all of his ace queens and ace 10s, I think we probably need to raise on the bigger side, like 1,100. But then you start raising a little bit smaller with your nut hands to get called and a little bit bigger with your bluffs to get folds. That's when you really open yourself up to your opponent crushing you. Because if your opponent ever figures out that you raise smaller with your nut hands and bigger with your bluffs, well, their adjustment's really, really easy. Of course, that said, how often do you really raise the river in this spot? It's like almost never. So your opponent's really not going to have that big of a sample size on you in this spot. So for that reason, if there is a time to get out of line to exploit the opponent, this is it. But this time, make it 900. It's probably a bit on the small side, but I'm okay with this. Our opponent does call, though, so clearly we lose, you would think. And he has pocket jacks. So one of the hands I said could be in his range, but there's only one combination of it. So when you run into these spots like this where your opponent just happened to have the one hand he didn't want him to have, realize that's okay. It's not the end of the world. A lot of people think, oh man, I played it so bad, the guy had a set. But you have to understand, your opponent's obviously never going to fold hands like this. So as long as they do have hands like ace queen and ace 10 in their range, then my play is probably going to be pretty good. But in this exact scenario, this time, it didn't work out. I want to thank you very much for being here today. If you have not already, check out my newest book, Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em. If you want to learn how to really think about poker, you have to think about ranges and not just how to play your exact hand. And that is really what Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em is all about. The book's about 480 pages long. We have over 230 in-depth range charts in it. So if you want to get good at the game, this book will help you do that. So check it out at jonathanlittlepoker.com/mastering. Thank you very much for being here today. Be sure to check back on Poker News next time for another one of my videos. Thanks for watching.